welcome to After Alexander, Episode 16, Seleucus I, the Gifted. As I said last week, this episode is going to be a review of everything that's happened from the lifetime of Alexander until Seleucus' death in 281. We've covered an awful lot in the 42 years since 323 BCE, so I thought it would be advisable to do a recap to avoid getting swept away by it all. Bear in mind, before I start, that a lot of detail is going to be glossed over here, as we've already covered all of this material before in previous episodes. So, without further ado, let's wind our way back to the deathbed of Alexander the Great. Our story began with the death of a 32-year-old Alexander. He had been on the throne of Macedon since he was 20, having succeeded his father Philip II after his assassination in 336. In that time, he had swept through the Persian Empire, absorbing its territories into Macedon and extending his borders further east still. His aim had once been to conquer India and reach what he thought was the edge of the world, but a series of factors conspired to prevent him from continuing and reaching the large armies of the Nanda Empire. Instead, he turned around, with the aim of eventually launching an expedition around Arabia to reach Egypt, as well as subjugating the North African portion of the Mediterranean. However, all of that changed with his death. I'm going to leave the topic of possible causes to one side for now, as I did at the beginning of our series, as I might come back to it one day in a special episode. All you need to know for the purposes of this rewind is that it's contentious, and there isn't one narrative. However it really happened, Alexander died. He left behind him the question of succession. There were three possible contenders: his possibly illegitimate 3-year-old son Heracles, his mentally handicapped half-brother Aridaeus, or his unborn child by Roxanne, whose gender was still obviously unknown at this point. There was a bit of a dispute between the senior commanders. The naval commander Nearchus favoured Heracles, but this was mostly due to his being married to Heracles' sister. Perdiccas, the leader of the companion cavalry, favoured waiting for the birth of the unborn child, while Meleager backed Aridaeus, and Ptolemy supported collective leadership by the leaders now present, perhaps already eyeing up independence. Eventually, after some political intriguing which I won't go into, a compromise co-kingship was agreed between Aridaeus, now called Philip III, and Alexander's then newborn son, Alexander IV. Perdiccas, who had been given Alexander's signet ring on his deathbed, had Alexander IV crowned after a victory he had in Cappadocia, which tied the kings to him and to his own success. At this point, Seleucus was the head of the companion cavalry, and an officer close to Perdiccas. Over the next few years, Perdiccas continued to accrue political chips. For example, although he was already married to Antipater's daughter Nicator, rumours abounded that he wanted to repudiate her and marry Alexander's full sister Cleopatra, which would leave him able to seize the kingship for himself, sort of a step up after the regency. This precedent of regency then kingship had been set by Philip II, Alexander's father, decades before, so it was a real possibility. Perdiccas' downfall came with Ptolemy, who had already made a nuisance of himself in the past by seizing territories around Egypt, but who sealed his fate by stealing Alexander's body, which was winding its way west from Babylon in a giant temple-shaped hearse, as we covered in episode 2. Perdiccas could not be seen to back down on this issue, so he invaded Egypt with an army. However, after several disastrous river crossings, he was assassinated by a group of men, including Seleucus. A conference then came at Triparadisus in 320 BCE, where Antipater was made the new regent and, amongst other territorial shufflings, Seleucus was given control of Babylon, the second richest province in the empire after Egypt. Speaking of Egypt, Ptolemy had himself been offered the regency, but he'd refused, preferring to focus on his own domain in Egypt rather than go for the big prize and risk flying too close to the sun. At this point, there were still a few pro-Perdiccas men in Anatolia, led by a wily commander called Eumenes. The new regent Antipater accordingly sent a fellow old-timer called Antigonus to go and deal with him. At this point in our story, Antigonus was a relative unknown to the younger generation. Both he and Antipater had been Philip II's generation, and had stayed behind in Macedon while the other successors went with Alexander on his conquests. This conflict between Antigones and Eumenes would have been part of the Second War of the Successors, which we didn't cover in any great detail on the show. However, as part of the fighting, Cassander, Antipater's son, would eventually end up in possession of the royal family and the old territories of European Macedon. After a long chase across the empire, Eumenes was eventually captured and executed by Antigonus in 316. However, his imperial ambitions now began to show themselves, which meant that he and Seleucus inevitably came to blows when he arrived in Babylon on his way back through the empire. Eventually, this all came to a head and Seleucus fled, fearing for his own life. Deciding against moving through pro-Antigonid country on his way to Macedon, he ended up in Egypt, where he was appointed commander of Ptolemy's Mediterranean fleet. All throughout the intrigues of the subsequent Third War of the Successors between the Antigonids and the Western successors, which again I'm not really going to go into, Seleucus remained subordinate to Ptolemy. The Ptolemaic success at the Battle of Gaza in 312 prompted Ptolemy to give Seleucus an army to retake Babylon, which he did the same year. He was presumably thrilled at this, as it meant he could stop playing second fiddle to Ptolemy, which he might otherwise potentially have been doomed to do forever. This re-entry into Babylon in 312 marked the last time Seleucus will be ejected from the region, and also the start of the Seleucid era calendar, which we're going to talk a bit more about during our break from the narrative over the course of the next few episodes. Although Antigonus and his son Demetrius tried several times to remove Seleucus again, as we saw back in episode 7, concerns in the west ultimately forced them to turn away. With this breathing room, Seleucus now did what Antigonus had failed to do during his time in power: concentrate on the eastern provinces. From 309 to 302, Seleucus swept through the east, first absorbing neighbouring pro-Antigonid regions in retribution for trying to oust him, before heading all the way to India. There appears to have been a brief conflict with the Mauryan Empire before a peace treaty was signed, granting the very easternmost provinces to the Mauryans in exchange for 500 war elephants. A marriage treaty was possibly also arranged during this time, possibly between Seleucus's daughter Berenike and Chandragupta himself, although it may also have referred to marriages between Greeks and Indians being legitimized. This treaty left both rulers free to concentrate on their respective enemies elsewhere. In the case of Seleucus, this naturally meant the Antigonids. As we discussed in episode 10, the Antigonids had declared themselves kings in 306 following the assassination of Alexander IV in or around 311, there are some question marks with this date, and Heracles of Macedon's death in 309. As an aside, Philip III had already been killed by Alexander's mother Olympias in 317 BCE. As nobody wanted to be left at a disadvantage by the Antigonids crowning themselves and seemingly filling the void of the now gone Argead dynasty, the other successors followed suit in 305, meaning that the last pretense of central imperial power was dispensed with. In 307, the Fourth War of the Successors was joined after Antigonus tried to flex his muscles in the Aegean Sea. This conflict is when the partially successful siege of Rhodes happened, that would give Demetrius his nickname Polyorketes, as well as getting him a mention in Anna Komnene's history book The Alexiad over a millennium later. During this war, the Antigonids seemed ascendant, briefly bottling Ptolemy up in Egypt, and but for the invention of a storm which demolished their navy, they might well have invaded and crushed Ptolemy underfoot. But, as I said, a storm intervened, and that chance was effectively gone. Again, I'm going to skip over most of the actual fighting, so see episodes 10 and 11 for details. Eventually, in 302, Lysimachus invaded Anatolia, which prompted both father and son of the Antigonids to turn on him, Antigonus from the east and Demetrius coming over from Greece in the west, where he'd been securing Antigonid rule. Lysimachus desperately called for help, but his call was not answered particularly enthusiastically. Ptolemy sallied out north, but fled back to Egypt after receiving false information that Antigonus had in fact won, while Cassander was only able to bring a small reinforcement to bear. Luckily for Lysimachus, though, he was saved by the arrival of Seleucus and his son Antiochus, who had been marching tirelessly from the east throughout 302. Antigonus had tried to stop exactly this westward progress by putting a diversionary force in place, in the form of an army heading for Babylon, but Seleucus simply sidestepped it and continued west to Anatolia, aware that the real showdown would take place there. So, in 301, the Battle of Ipsus was joined in Anatolia. This battle was a game-changer for everyone involved, as Antigonus was killed and Demetrius was forced to flee, now a nearly landless fugitive. In the sharing of landly spoils, Seleucus received all of Syria north of the Eleutheros River. He claimed ownership of the rest of Syria as well, which had been occupied by Ptolemy as part of his ambition to give Egypt a buffer zone, but did not act upon this claim due to his old friendship with Ptolemy from back during his days of exile. There was still a tangible tension despite this, which led to a marriage alliance between Ptolemy, Cassander, and Lysimachus on the one hand, followed on the other hand by one between Demetrius and Seleucus. With the capture of Syria, Seleucus had effectively stepped into the power vacuum that Antigonus had left behind with his fall at Ipsus, hence the alliance of the Western powers, as they feared his growing might. As we will get to when we review Antiochus I in a few episodes' time, Seleucus had installed his son as co-king, ruling over everything east of the Euphrates River from the mid to late 290s. This allowed Seleucus to concentrate on the west, knowing that there was a friendly power in his rear to the east. Now, Demetrius slowly began building the Antigonids back up again, and managed to eject a man called Pleistarchus from Cilicia. However, all this really did was awaken the other powers to the fact that the Antigonids were not quite done yet, and the old anti-Antigonid alliance reformed. In the subsequent fighting, Demetrius installed himself on the throne of Macedon, ejecting Cassander's squabbling family, and eventually conceived of a plan to invade Lysimachus and Seleucus' territories. This plan began as a reasonable enough strategy to distract Lysimachus by landing in his rear, but slowly morphed into a grander vision. Specifically, Demetrius aimed to conquer the eastern provinces before destroying Seleucus. However, this didn't pan out quite as he'd intended, unfortunately enough for the Antigonids. He was eventually pinned down in Cilicia by both Seleucus and Agathocles, Lysimachus' son. He briefly tried to negotiate, before instead turning to harassing the nearby countryside. Despite his best efforts, his men defected to Seleucus in a battle, and he was captured trying to flee back to Greece. He would die in 283 by drinking himself to death, before Seleucus, who had captured him, could use him as a political pawn. His son Antigones II, still in charge of the Antigonid heartland in Greece and Macedon, found himself attacked from both sides by Lysimachus and Pyrrhus of Epirus, a western power in the Balkans, meaning his territory was greatly reduced. Meanwhile, over in Egypt, Ptolemy I was preparing to retire. He had always slated Ptolemy Caraunus, his eldest son by a woman called Eurydice, as his heir apparent. However, shortly before his abdication in 285, he changed his mind and made Ptolemy II his heir instead, for reasons that aren't clear. Ptolemy the Thunderbolt fled Egypt when his half-brother came to power, and came to take up residence eventually at Lysimachus's court. There, he contributed to the political intrigue that would see Lysimachus have his eldest son Agathocles murdered. In the aftermath, the Thunderbolt fled to Seleucus' realm, who was delighted at the opportunity that having the arguably rightful heir of Egypt could provide. But Egypt would have to wait. Agathocles' wife and children also turned up in Seleucus' domains, along with a stream of people and complaints urging him to take down Lysimachus, whose support melted away following the murder of the popular Agathocles. So, Seleucus invaded, and Seleucus and Lysimachus met in battle at Corupedium in 281. During this battle, Lysimachus was killed by a pro-Seleucid refugee, and his body was buried by his son Alexander, despite the wishes of his widowed daughter-in-law. Seleucus was now the only successor of his generation left, which some have pointed out must have been quite a lonely position. But the death of Lysimachus also left Seleucus essentially in control of his realms of Anatolia, Thrace, and a portion of Macedon, which he conveniently forgot to hand over to Agathocles' son. Macedon was now open to him as well. In fact, the only serious opposition to his growing ambition of reuniting Alexander's empire was Egypt, which he hoped to take with the same strategy of invading in the name of the rightful heir. His plan would have been to use Ptolemy the Thunderbolt as his pawn to absorb Egypt back into the fold as well. Sadly for him and for his dynasty, this aim was thwarted by the Thunderbolt's realization that Seleucus was the only force now pushing for reunification, and indeed for Seleucid supremacy. It is possible that Seleucus had made his ambition a bit too clear to the Thunderbolt, which prompted him to act. In September 281, while the army was quartered at Lysimachia as part of their push into Macedon, Seleucus travelled out with a few companions to a pile of stones called the Argos. This collection of stones, not far from the city and the road, was supposed to have been constructed either by the troops preparing to fight against Troy, or the Argonauts of Jason and the Argonauts fame. While he was listening to the stories of olden days, Seleucus was assassinated by Ptolemy Ceraunus. With our review of him done, I'm now going to give you my opinion of the man we've spent so much of our narrative with. As you saw from the episode title, I've given him the nickname The Gifted, as my take of a 21st century equivalent to his ancient Greek epithet Nicator, meaning the victor. So, why The Gifted exactly? Well, it can be seen in two ways, both of which I feel apply to Seleucus. In the first instance, gifted can mean talented, which he certainly was. You don't just become ruler of most of the known world by chance, after all. For instance, even if we don't know whether he won or lost the campaign, he was insightful enough to realise that the easternmost provinces weren't worth fighting over with the Mauryans, and that a secure border was more valuable to him. Now, I could be wrong, but I can't imagine Alexander the Great making the same decision. As we've discussed before, it took the combination of several adverse factors at once to persuade Alexander to turn around. Added to this, Seleucus seems to me to have been politically adept, thriving in the toxic and chaotic world after Alexander's death. He also appears charismatic, having armies defect to him several times. So, that's the first interpretation. Alternatively, gifted could mean lucky. In my opinion, several of his major successes came through luck. He was able to avoid the brunt of Antigonus's wrath after reclaiming Babylon in 312 because Antigonus had to focus on other matters. Added to that, there's his conquest of the eastern provinces, which made him such a great power in the end. This conquest was initially possible because his first two targets were functionally leaderless. One of the satraps ranged against him had died, and the other had been made a fugitive after his army defected to Seleucus in a battle to try and eject him from Babylon. Added to that, this conquest was also possible due to the fact that Antigonus, the head honcho of his day, was simply not interested in the east, instead preferring to turn his eyes westwards. Ipsus itself was only so decisive because Antiochus and Seleucus arrived in time to save Lysimachus. Had they been delayed, it might have played out very differently. And again, a similar situation plays out at Corupedium. Lysimachus wasn't outmaneuvered in some brilliant strategy, at least as far as we know, but was stabbed by a lone refugee. So, in many instances in Seleucus's life, luck appears to play more of a part than his own skill. Despite this, I think Seleucus did have the political wherewithal to react appropriately when fortune smiled on him. When Agathocles was murdered, he declared for Agathocles' son as the rightful heir, probably because he knew that this was what people wanted to hear and what would give him an opening into Lysimachus's domains. In addition, from a human perspective, you get the sense of a genuine fondness for his son, which I'll leave now as a little teaser to discuss in more detail when we get to Antiochus himself. All in all, Seleucus to me seems to have a combination of those attributes which often make for the most famous military heroes: talent and luck. Hence my 21st century nickname for him, which I believe is a fitting one: Seleucus I, the Gifted. Next time, we won't move on to Antiochus just yet, as I've got 4 or so bonus episodes planned. The first of these will be a discussion of the cities founded by Seleucus: how many, when they were founded, why, and their future importance. We won't get through all of them, obviously, but it's at least an interesting discussion. After that, I think the next one I've got planned is on the Seleucid calendar, so lots to look forward to. Alternatively, if you're impatient to just get on with the story, I can now hesitantly say that we will pick up again with Antiochus after about 4 bonus episodes on the 8th of May. So, just to recap that, potentially as many as 4 bonus episodes before we rejoin the narrative early in May. As always, thank you all for listening, and feel free to get in touch with the show at afteralexpod@gmail.com if you have any questions or comments. Until next time, have a great week, everyone.